back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Trial Network. I'll be your host this afternoon. I'm Rachel Stockman. We have some legal experts standing by. We'll bring them in just a few minutes. We have a lot going on here on the Law and Crime Network, and a lot planned to bring to you on Monday live. But before we do, let's take a look at some of what else is trending across America.
Here are today's top crime stories trending on lawandcrime.com and across the country. Authorities in Nevada identified the suspect who reportedly ran over and killed a manicurist after getting her credit card declined on a $35 bill. The suspect, 21-year-old Crystal Whipple, reportedly went to the Crystal Nails and Spa near the Las Vegas Strip to get her nails done. After her manicure, Whipple's credit card was reportedly declined, and she tried to flee in a stolen vehicle. That's when she reportedly fatally ran over her manicurist, 51-year-old Naknu Nijin, before fleeing the scene of the crime. Nijin's death was ruled a homicide, and the suspect remains at large. A man in Texas accused of killing his 3 children and shooting his wife turned himself into authorities. 27-year-old Junaid Hassim Mahmoud is accused of fatally shooting his 3 young children and shooting his wife in the head in their Texas City apartment. The unidentified woman was transported to an area hospital for treatment. Mahmoud is now being held on an unrelated warrant pending new charges. A couple in Ohio who wrote to mass shooter Dylan Roof were indicted in federal court after an FBI sting operation uncovered their plans to bomb a bar in Toledo. The suspects, Elizabeth Lacron and Vincent Armstrong, are accused of plotting an upscale mass murder at a local Toledo bar and reportedly told undercover FBI agents they were making a pipe bomb. Lacron had previously reached out to Dylan Roof, the accused Charleston church shooter who killed 9 in June 2015. Lacron and Armstrong now face multiple charges and could spend life in prison if convicted. Those were today's top crime stories. I'm Anthony Velez for Law and Crime.
All right, as I mentioned, we also have a lot coming up starting live on Monday here on the Law and Crime Network. We're going to take you live to California for opening statements in the Charles Merritt case. This is the case involving the murders of the McStay family. Charles Merritt, 61, whose mugshot you see there, is charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. The family, they disappeared back in 2010. Police for many years had believed that they had escaped to Mexico for whatever reason. And it wasn't until November 11th, 2013 that an off-road motorcyclist discovered the bodies of the McStay family in 2 shallow graves in the outskirts of the Mojave Desert. Police conducted a 3-day, 30-hour investigation of the crime scene and were able to identify the bodies through DNA. Now, Charles Merritt is going on trial. He was arrested in November of 2014. He's going on trial on Monday. He was a business associate of Joseph McStay. We're going to be covering that trial live here. We hope to bring it to you live. We are sending a reporter there to California. The judge has not made a final ruling yet if they will allow live streaming, but in whatever way, whether it's through clips or through live streaming, we'll have a reporter there and we will bring you the latest. Another big trial that starts next week is the case of the Uber driver accused of killing 6 different people. This is Jason Dalton, and he is the one facing murder charges. That trial begins on Tuesday, and here's a quick preview of what to expect.
A former Michigan Uber driver could get life in prison for a 2016 shooting rampage that left 6 people dead. Prosecutors say Jason Dalton killed 6 and critically injured 2, including a teenage girl. The frenzy began while Dalton was transporting a passenger from Kalamazoo College. Dalton claimed he began seeing strange symbols on his phone, and a sensation came over his body. He began driving erratically through the streets, frightening the rider, who was eventually able to escape. Dalton told police he drove back to his home and began preparing his weapons. He said he drove to an apartment complex intending to pick up a rider. Instead, he found 25-year-old Tiana Carruthers. Dalton shot her multiple times. Tiana managed to survive. Dalton continued, reportedly fatally gunning down 53-year-old Richard Smith and his son, 17-year-old Tyler Smith, at a car dealership around 10 p.m. The final shooting occurred less than 20 minutes later, when Dalton allegedly shot 4 women and a young girl in a Cracker Barrel parking lot. Sisters-in-law Mary Lou and Mary Jo Nye, Dorothy Brown, and Barbara Hawthorne were among the dead. Barbara's family friend, a 14-year-old, sustained a gunshot wound to the skull, but managed to survive. In interviews with police, Dalton said it was like it wasn't even himself. He further explained to a psychiatrist, "It almost seemed like my phone could control me," despite reportedly having no history of psychiatric delusions. In spite of his claims, he was found competent to stand trial in April 2016. An appeals court threw out the confession Dalton made to police, citing Miranda violations. Dalton pleaded not guilty to the charges. His defense attorney has expressed intent to use an insanity defense. Dalton faces 6 counts of murder, 8 weapons charges, and 2 counts of assault with intent to murder. For the Law and Crime Network, I'm Aaron Keller.
Again, this is going to be quite the fascinating trial. We expect opening statements on Tuesday. I want to bring in my guest now, Mike Koribanics, who is a criminal defense attorney here in the New York area. And we also have Mark Mangino. He joins us on the phone as well. Let's take it to you first, Mike. When we look at this case and we look at the facts, he's going for an insanity defense. He doesn't have a history of any kind of delusions or real mental health issues. Based on the facts that we know, how do you think that will fare at trial?
You know, it's a very unusual type of case because there is no psychiatric history. I just can't help but thinking of the Son of Sam killings in the 1970s in New York, where he thought his dog was speaking to him. But this is what I think is going to be a tough road to hoe. Is the one part in that report where he said that it almost seemed like my phone had taken me over. It seems like usually in insanity defenses, people don't have a big recollection of it, or there's a total disconnect. There almost seems to be a rational excuse as to why he did what he had to do. I think he's got a tough road to hoe.
How about you, Mark, the insanity defense in this case?
Yeah, I think it's going to be tough. I mean, obviously, he's competent to stand trial. And in order to prove an insanity defense, you'd have to show that the defendant, didn't understand the difference between right and wrong. That it's not, his phone took him over is what he explains. But, did he understand that shooting people is a crime and murdering people is a crime? If he didn't do that, I mean, if he's going to come forward and say, I thought these were aliens, and I needed to rid the planet of aliens, that might be a different story. But an insanity defense is going to be very difficult in this case.
Well, it's certainly a very tragic story, and one of the surviving victims expected to take the stand during that trial, so it's certainly going to be an interesting one to watch unfold. And we will bring it to you here live on the Law and Crime Network with opening statements expected to begin on Tuesday. I now want to turn to another trial that we covered here on the Law and Crime Network last year, but we're reviewing because it was such a high-profile case. And that is the case against Frankie Gephardt. This was a cold case. This man accused of a 1983 brutal slaying of a black man. The motive? Prosecutors say he was racist, and he saw Timothy Coggins, the victim, dancing with his, quote, old lady, got upset that evening in 1983, and took Timothy Coggins, according to prosecutors, in his truck, stabbed him 30 times, mutilated his genitals, and then tied him to the back of a truck. Here's the problem in this case, though, and one we're going to continue to dig into with my panel of experts this afternoon. You don't have any direct physical evidence in this case, and you have 6 out of 7 witnesses to this crime who are currently in jail and have some pretty shady past. So let's take a look inside this case and bring you first the prosecution's openings. Take a look.
You will hear over 30 injuries to his body. You will hear that he had dirt and the red clay in the ground battered in his hair. Abrasions all over him. His pants, his underwear, his blue jeans, covered in mud and blood, ripped to his knees. His shoes missing, an undershirt missing. You see, Bill Moore and Frankie Gephardt acted as what is known as parties to a crime. And what you'll hear throughout the course of this trial is that the defendant acknowledges that to multiple people. He tells people, as you'll hear from this stand, that he killed everyone, stabbed him multiple times, tied his feet to the back of the truck with a logging chain, and drug him up and down the power line.
Okay, so you heard the prosecutor there really trying to lay out a little bit of this case and emphasizing really what is their strongest evidence, Mike, and that is that this guy had bragged about doing this crime to other people. That's a hard case, though, even if it wasn't a cold case.
I have such mixed feelings about that. In the rules of evidence, we call them admissions against interest. And the rules of evidence give that such credence. In this day and age where people are on social media trying to build reputations that really don't exist, I don't think it's that strong of evidence. But I think a lot of people in juries do think it is when they see it in the context of a courtroom. I don't really agree with that as being strong evidence because sometimes people take credit for things to make them look like tough guys, and they never have to be.
And Matt Mangino, I want to apologize. I called you Mark earlier. I apologize for that. Do you think the fact that he bragged about this, and by the way, he never really used the name of the victim, Timothy Coggins. He used a racial slur when referring to what he did, according to the witnesses. That's the crux of the prosecution's case.
Well, I think it's all about context in this case. And how many times did he make this reference? I mean, if one time in 34 years he made some reference through a racial epithet that he was involved in a murder, I mean, that's tough. But if he had a continuous pattern of talking about this, of bragging about this, of comparing stories with another person who was involved in this, I think that's a different situation than one statement against interest, and I think as you put those pieces together, it gains more traction.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to continue to follow this case, and we're going to bring you the defense's opening statement when we return. How are they going to try to get their guy off the hook in this case? You'll see when we return. Stay with us. Welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Trial Network. We're covering the cold case murder case against Frankie Gephardt. It's a case that we followed very closely out of Spalding County, Georgia. There's Frankie Gephardt. He's charged with murder for the alleged brutal killing in 1983 of a young man by the name of Timothy Coggins. He was stabbed 30 times and allegedly dragged at the back of a car. This was a crime that went unsolved for decades until 2015 when a man came forward with information about the case. Before the break, you heard the prosecution's openings. Now, let's see how the defense plans to defend their guy. Take a listen.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Broder told you this is a cold case. It is. It's a really old case. But the state does not get a pass because the case is old. They have to prove to you this case just like they prove any other case. If this murder happened yesterday, the burden's beyond a reasonable doubt. Whether it happened yesterday or 30 years ago. On October 9th, they're the ones that walked up on the body. They're the ones that found it. And 20 and 30 years later, they're the ones telling you, Mr. Gephardt said something about killing this man. You're going to hear from some folks who are jailhouse informants, let's put it that way. You're going to hear from a couple of guys, I imagine, who are going to say while they were in jail with Frankie that he made statements about this case. Again, I just want you to remember and look at where is that information coming from? What is their motivation for telling this?
Okay, so the defense attorney really hammering on exactly what we were talking about before. The fact that while the prosecution has several witnesses saying, yes, Frankie Gephardt admitted to these crimes, the quality of these witnesses is questionable. Mike.
It's questionable. I don't know, though, in an opening, as you speak about the quality of these witnesses, you really want to lay out to the jury what they're going to do. These witnesses are very unpredictable. And I think that you just lay out where they're coming from, but not get so specific because you don't know where they're going. And sometimes, that's your intro to the jury. And if you don't deliver on your promise of how these people are going to testify, you're in for a whole lot of problems. And I think it's always better to slowly educate the jury about the kind of witness you're going to have, especially jailhouse informants.
So did you think the defense there did a good job with the openings? I thought they were a little slow paced for me. I had trouble paying attention and getting to his point.
Well, yeah, being a Jersey and New York guy, it's very difficult when you see the Southern people, the way they try cases down there. It's much slower,
yes,
much more polite, and much less of the pace that we're used to here. I thought it was a little slow and a little hard to follow.
How about you, Matt Mangino?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, he is playing to his audience. That's what those jurors and those people in this community.
This is a really rural county in Georgia, by the way.
Right. So I think he knows what they want to hear, and he knows how they want it presented. If he's an experienced defense attorney, this case is about credibility, believability. Are you going to believe the witnesses that take the witness stand that say that the defendant bragged about this? He bragged about it to family. He bragged about it in jail. And, you have to, what is the motivation of the witnesses? The jury has to decide credibility, as they do in every case. And that's what this case will come down to.
Well, I'll say from living in Atlanta and being familiar with some of these more rural areas that, it is very different in rural areas of Georgia. And it would especially be different back in 1983 in the culture, perhaps, of not wanting to snitch on somebody that did something like this. Probably wouldn't be all that surprising. So when we come back, unfortunately, we have to take a quick break. But when we come back, you're going to hear from witnesses that were the last to see Timothy Coggins alive that night in 1983 when he was in a dance club. You're going to want to stick around for this. Stay with us. All right, we now have some testimony from the victim's sister who was inside the club that night, and she said she saw Timothy Coggins interacting with some white people at this club. And as the officer and family friend testified to, this was not normal. So take a listen.
Can you tell the jury your relationship with Tim Coggins?
Timothy Coggins is my brother.
And how far apart in age were y'all? 2
years.
And there are a lot of siblings.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, how many siblings?
8.
All right. And so you and Tim were pretty close?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 6. And I'm going to ask you if you recognize it.
Yes, I do.
What is that?
My brother, Timothy Coggins.
And is that a picture of him in life?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'll tender State's Exhibit 6.
It's admitted.
Permission to publish?
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about Tim.
Tim was very loving. He was very caring. And he was very funny. And he loved to dance. And he loved his family.
They love to dance?
Loved to dance.
Is it fair to say he liked to have a good time?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Did Tim ever tell you who she was?
No. I never asked, but I do recall the very first time I seen her sitting at the bar. And the very first time I seen her talking with Tim, I didn't like it. I didn't feel comfortable with it.
Tell the jury why you didn't feel comfortable.
Well, mainly because it was to me, this is just my opinion. When you see a white person come to an all-black club, and if they ain't, came with somebody and just pop up by themselves, to me it raises a red flag.
Did you remember anything about her hair or body or anything like that?
Yeah, I remember her being just about my height, and I can't tell you exactly about her face, but I know she had long brown hair.
Okay. When was the last time you saw your brother alive?
The last time I saw him alive was on a Friday night. We was at the club, and it was crowded as always. And I remember I was going to the bathroom, and I remember I can hear the people in the crowd saying, "He's looking for Tim." And I happened to look back, and I said, I looked and I saw this tall white guy with, he had a cap on his head, no facial hair looked like, and he had on a white t-shirt and overalls. So when I looked and seen that, I'm trying to get through the crowd because I want to know where he wanted with my brother. So me making my way through the crowd, trying to get there to see what, what was going on. And by the time I got there and got outside, they were gone.
Okay, this is just fascinating. You are hearing testimony from probably what may have been one of the last people to see Timothy Coggins alive, his sister. You heard testimony from her there, talking about the nightclub and the fact that Timothy Coggins had, on several occasions it sounded like, been dancing with a white woman who had come to this what was typically a black club in the community there. And she testified to the fact that she thought it was strange. She claimed it raised red flags seeing him doing that. I want to bring in my guest quickly, Matt Mangino. He joins me via Skype. What do you make of her testimony?
Well, I think that what the prosecution is trying to do here is to piece together as best that they can the night that Tim Coggins disappeared, even though it was 34, 35 years ago. So his sister sees him with a big white guy with a hat on and a white T-shirt, or sees that person looking for him. She also sets the scene that he's dancing with a white woman. So they're trying to pull those pieces of evidence together to show that in fact Frankie Gephardt was in that bar that night looking for Tim Coggins.
But let me ask you this, Mike. I keep looking at this trial and forgetting that the memories that these witnesses are referring to happened back in 1983. Does that make you feel differently about the testimony we just heard, or you think people would adequately recall things like this?
Well, it very much puzzles me, and like Matt said before, it all becomes different context. I mean, we're talking about things that raised red flags, as they testified to, over 30 years ago, but yet you're talking to a jury 30 years later.
Right.
And it just seems somehow, some of these things seem so out of context to be judging 30 years later. And I think that's what's always a difficulty in a cold case.
Especially when, like in this case, there is no physical evidence linking Frankie Gephardt to the crime. This whole case is really based on the testimony of witnesses who say Frankie Gephardt admitted to killing Timothy Coggins, really a hate crime because he was a racist. The question in this case, is that enough to convict Frankie Gephardt? Now, when we come back, we're going to get some testimony from the medical examiner. It's going to be a bit tough to listen to, but you can hear from and understand some of the injuries that Timothy Coggins faced. Stay with us here on Law and Crime. Welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Trial Network. We're going to take you back to Georgia, where we're deep inside that case in Spalding County, where Frankie Gephardt is accused of a racially motivated murder. He's accused of killing 23-year-old Timothy Coggins back in 1983. Timothy Coggins died a brutal death. He was stabbed 30 times. His genitals were mutilated. Let's hear a bit more about his injuries from the medical examiner.
What is the jury looking at here, Mr. Tillman?
This is a group of approximately 7 stab wounds on the posterior surface, as well as 2 incised wounds making an X across this way.
Okay. And State's Exhibit 5.
This is the area of the hand. I discerned a blue ink tattoo of the word Barbara on the hand, as well as a number of defensive wounds and stab wounds on the left wrist, one exposing the radius here.
Okay, so this here, and for the record, we're pointing to the middle and the up part of the top part of the photo.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying is a defensive wound?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk in detail, Mr. Tillman, about the wounds on Mr. Coggins.
Okay.
I think that's as wide as I can get, so I'll have to have. Here we go.
Then I noticed in the eyes that they were swollen. There was a large number of maggot activity. Then there is a 4th wound that is a laceration located at the left lateral canthus of the left eye. There is a 5th wound underneath the infraorbital ridge here. That's a laceration, and it's about 1 1/4 inches by 3/8 inch. So that pretty much takes care of the front. On the back, there were 3 lacerations that we can talk about for the head. There are 3 lacerations located with the back of the head. Again, lacerations means it is pressure against the skull. It's not a cut.
And I think you explained it to the jury earlier as maybe hitting something.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
And let's see, then I reflected the scalp during this process, and that's called the galea, and you look underneath that, and I saw the hemorrhage from these lacerations, but there were no fractures to the skull. All right.
Should we move on to the neck area?
Yep. Then we'll go down to the neck region where there's 2 incised wounds. The first begins at the left lateral midline, continues across the anterior midline. This is number 7, and continues for a total length of approximately 4 inches. The second is just superior to the first and extends across the anterior.
And I just want to explain a quick thing that, for a lot of that soundbite, you weren't able to see the medical examiner because he was so close to those graphic pictures of Timothy Coggins and his body, and we didn't want to show that on camera because it's so graphic. But again, the injuries that Timothy Coggins faced in this racially motivated crime were horrific. Stabbing 30 times, mutilated genitals, being dragged by a vehicle, tied and dragged by a vehicle. Frankie Gephardt, the defendant who's facing the murder charges, had a jailhouse interview. I want to play part of that, and then I'm going to bring in my panel of legal experts to testify, not really testify, but to comment. Take a listen.
The reason we're here, and what we wanted to talk to you about now, is in 1983, there was a body found in North Powell County. There was a black guy that was found dead off Manor Road.
In 83. How many years? That's been 30 something years.
It's been a while. You ever saw him before?
Never saw him before.
Is there a reason why other folks that were interviewed can identify you as picking him up?
Huh?
There's other people that we've talked to who have said that they saw you with Bill Moore pick him up.
No.
So you and Bill Moore never picked him up?
I ain't never checked it. I don't know it.
Well, there's other people that are saying that.
Well, I can't answer what other people say. I can't answer that.
Well, let me ask you this, Frank. A while ago I asked you, had you ever told anybody that you killed somebody at a party and you said you couldn't remember?
I don't know.
Okay.
They're saying that you said it was true or not.
I don't care what you say.
They also say that you admitted to killing that guy in that picture at a party.
I don't care what you say.
But you're not denying it. But you're not denying it.
Damn right I deny it. So I don't know if I killed somebody or not. I ain't no damn fool. I might be crazy, but I ain't no fool.
Would you tell us if you killed somebody?
You goddamn right I would.
Wow. Listening to this jailhouse interview with Frankie Gephardt is quite unbelievable. You heard him there in all that language, denying the allegations against him when he was confronted by investigators about whether he killed Timothy Coggins. Mike Koribanics, criminal defense attorney here, and I were kind of talking back and forth that it is quite unbelievable. Here he is in jail doing this interview.
I can't get over that. It's tough for me to believe he wasn't represented by counsel, and that the fact they could go to the jail and interview him without some sort of, I would hope there was some sort of waiver, but I can't understand how any attorney would allow their client with these kind of charges to be interviewed. Whether he denies it or not, it doesn't play well at all.
It does not play well at all. And Matt Magino, I'm sure you caught on to this too. While he was denying it, he actually displayed his own racism right in that interview, using the N-word.
Right. I mean, there's no question that's not going to endear him with the jury. You know, the only reason the prosecution would even play this tape, I would assume, was to kind of offset the defense using it, because he doesn't admit to anything, and he's adamant that he doesn't know anything about the person depicted in the photograph, and he doesn't know anything about a murder, and that he never murdered anybody. So this is just like, I think, to try to make sure that this isn't used, you know, by the defense to try to, you know, diminish the prosecution's case. They want to put everything out front.
Yeah, and he certainly doesn't come off as the smartest tool in the shed either during this interview. You can tell that for sure. Okay, we have a lot more to cover in this case, including you're going to hear from witnesses that say Gephardt admitted to it. Stay with us. We'll be right back. All right, thank you so much, Anthony. I also want to give an update on another case that we've been following, and that's out of Colorado, that missing woman. Well, her fiancé, Patrick Frazee, was charged with her murder. She had been missing since around the Thanksgiving time. He was charged around Christmas with her murder and solicitation for capital murder. He appeared in court today, and the prosecution dropped a request to bar the defendant from learning the contents of his arrest affidavit. That arrest affidavit will also remain sealed to the public as well. I want to bring in Mike really quickly to talk about this, because this is quite unusual that, you know, first of all, they're barring the public from learning the contents of the arrest affidavit, but that they didn't even want the defense attorneys to share that affidavit with their client. Have you ever heard of this happening before?
That's quite unusual. Sometimes what will happen, you'll see it more in organized crime cases where they're worried about something in an affidavit, my instinct is telling me, contains something about a witness who they're in fear for their safety, so they want to hold that as long as they can. That's the only thing I can think of, and why it's not being released to the public.
And you'll remember he's also facing that solicitation charge, so there's some clear indications here that someone else was involved in the alleged murder of his fiancée. So very strange. I think many of us are dying to know what is in that arrest affidavit and why the prosecution really did not want him to see it. Ultimately, they dropped that request during a hearing today. We're going to continue to follow that case and bring you any new updates just as soon as we can. In the meantime, let's continue our review of the Frankie Gephardt case. Before the break, we played some sound from the police interview from inside the jail. And Mike, we were just talking about how unusual it was for the police to be able to interview him in jail.
It's so unusual because he's in jail. Obviously, he's appeared at court hearings. He's represented by counsel. So how they go in and speak to him without his counsel present, or without his counsel present and providing a waiver, it's just really highly unusual.
And some of the language we heard coming out of Frankie Gephardt's mouth, very, very shocking to say the least. Okay, so we're going to now get to the crux of the prosecution's case, and we're going to hear from the informants that basically ratted out Frankie Gephardt, saying that Frankie Gephardt admitted to the killing, to the cold case, brutal slaying of a young black man in 1983 that was racially motivated. Take a listen.
How do you know him?
I've been knowing him ever since he was about 6 years old.
Okay. Do you see him in the courtroom today?
Sitting right there.
Okay. Could you tell me something he's wearing? Something that he's wearing today?
He's wearing a suit and a goatee and a shirt and...
Okay. Back on October...
That just described all three at the table.
And he's bald-headed, too.
What now?
And he's bald-headed, too.
He's bald-headed.
And still no.
I think it'd be sufficient, Judge.
I think so, yes.
Okay. Did he tell you what Bill did to the victim?
He said he stabbed him.
Okay. Did he tell you how many times?
He didn't never say about that.
Okay. Now, have you been friends with the defendant since this time?
Yeah.
Okay. And do you have anything against him? Are you mad at him in any way?
Mm-mm.
What did you do with this information? What did you do with it when he told you a couple weeks after you found the body that he and Bill Moore had killed this boy? What did you do with this information?
I took it to Dean Ray.
And who is Dean Ray?
He was a narcotic agent.
You say was. He's deceased now.
Yeah, he's deceased now.
Okay. So you told Dean Ray about this a couple of weeks after you found the body?
About 3 days after Frankie told me, I run into Dean and told him.
Okay. And you don't know what happened with that information?
Nothing for what I know.
Okay.
I mean, nothing never come about it.
When was the first time an investigator came to you and did a formal interview with you?
I want to say about 8 months ago now.
Okay, so this is Willard Sanders. Not only did he discover the body, he also happens to be friends with Frankie Gephardt, the defendant. And Frankie Gephardt, a few weeks after this incident, admits to the whole thing. Apparently, according to this testimony from Willard Sanders.
It's unbelievable.
I'm kind of shocked listening to this guy because it's so nonchalant. Like, he's acting like, oh, yeah, I killed a guy like it was a normal thing you talk about. And he doesn't run to the police. He says, I happened to run into my friend who was an officer 3 days later. I mentioned it to him. I don't know if he did anything about it.
Well, the most unusual, like just before we came back to the studio, it appeared he said, when she asked him the question, did you talk to an investigator? He said, yeah, like 8 months later. It's almost
a couple days later, he said, yeah.
And it's almost like they're like on another planet. It just is the lack of, any sort of emotion about discovering a dead body that a friend of yours is allegedly responsible for. It's almost incredible.
It just seemed like another day in the life of these people. It's crazy. Okay, so let's listen to Robert Smith, Gephardt's friend, who Gephardt also apparently told this guy about the murder. Take a listen.
Are you familiar with that picture?
Yes, sir, I am.
You know the person in that picture?
Yes, sir. This is the guy, Mr. Coggins, that I seen around this one.
And if you could speak up a little bit so the last juror
Yes, sir, I do know him.
Okay. Yes. Is that the person you know as Timothy Coggins?
Yes, sir.
Is that the person that you saw in the trailer park on multiple occasions?
Yes, sir, it is.
Is that the person that you saw partying at parties with Mr. Gephardt and Mr. Moore?
Yes, sir, it is.
No, that's what publishes.
Yes.
Mr. Smith, do you recall a party at the trailer park where Tim ran to your trailer, or the trailer you were at?
Yes, sir, I do. I was down at, it was like 3 trailers on the back side of the road of it. I was down in the middle trailer in between the two, and up on the hill is where Gephardt lived, and they was having a party up there. And us guys down here, you know, we was drinking and stuff, just hanging out. And I remember Mr. Coggins come running down through there, and he ran up in the trailer. Somebody told him to hide in the trailer. And the guy that lived there, I believe his name was like Dennis or something like that. But he lived there, and he told him, said, run in the trailer, hide in the trailer.
So you can't testify as to what other people said, okay?
Yes.
And did Mr. Gephardt say anything about the murder that occurred in 1983?
Yes, sir, he did. I was at a residence over on Patterson Road, which I believe was Mr. Gephardt's at the time. And we was all sitting around drinking and cooking out or whatever. And he was like, asked me if I remember back the time when we hung out at the trailer park in Sunnyside. Because he said that he was waiting on this girl to show up that night, whom was a friend of the girl I was with. And I had just told him, I said, well, I seen her over on Drury Avenue. She was over there with these people over there, them dope heads and everything. And he said, over there with all them black people? And I said, yeah. And he said, I figured she was one of them nigger lovers, you know. And then he stated to me, he said, well, you remember back in the day, he said that one, he didn't ever live to tell about that white girl he was with. So.
All right, that is certainly some interesting testimony from Robert Smith, Gephardt's friend, who talks about an incident. And I think it's pretty powerful testimony because he describes seeing Timothy Coggins, seeing Gephardt, Bill Moore running after Coggins and, you know, using a racial slur, saying they're after that N-word.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I was trying to visualize as he was speaking was he was apparently sitting in a trailer and Coggins runs up the stairs past him into the trailer, and that's the last time he saw him. But he doesn't say how Coggins
came out of the trailer.
Yeah, or if it was Gephardt and Moore who went and got him. But the whole circumstance is not looking very good for the defense here. This is a very powerful witness.
But at the same time, you know, this is testimony from years and years ago. But I think one of the things I would, as a juror, probably consider is, what incentive would these guys have to lie about what happened, right? Because, I mean, it doesn't seem like they're friends with Gephardt. They're not friends with Coggins. Why would they want to rat this guy out?
That's why I think that these are very difficult. You know, they always say facts are very stubborn, and when there's no reason to cross-examine a witness as to any bias or anything of that nature, it appears they were friendly. I mean, they drank a lot together. It seems like they drank an awful lot together.
Right.
They hung out together. They went from various geographical locations together. I mean, he sees them later, a few years later. You remember the time at the trailer park? I think these are very, very credible witnesses, and they're going to be tough for the defense to shake.
Well, we're going to continue digging into this case. We're going to hear from a few more witnesses, including Terry Reed, who befriended Gephardt in jail. You're going to hear what he had to say. We have to take a quick break, but we will be back in just a few minutes. Stay with us here on Law&Crime. And welcome back, everybody, to the Law&Crime Trial Network. We're going to take you back to that case in Georgia against Frankie Gephardt, that cold case brutal slaying that happened back in 1983. Gephardt on trial for a racially motivated killing of 23-year-old Timothy Coggins. The prosecutor says that Gephardt saw Timothy Coggins dancing with a white woman at a club back in 1983, got so enraged, worked with another man by the name of Bill Moore, and brutalized him that evening, stabbing him 30 times, mutilating his genitals, dragging his body at the back of a truck, chaining him up. Really horrible, awful case. But the question is, we've heard from the witnesses in this case who said, yes, Gephardt admitted to this. You heard from several witnesses who said that. Is there any physical evidence actually tying him to the crime? Not really. But there's something that's helpful, and that is that when Gephardt was in jail for another crime, alleged crime, not related to this murder, he told a guy by the name of Terry Reed that he hid evidence in a well from the night of the crime. Let's listen to Terry Reed's testimony.
Mr. Reed, you're currently incarcerated at Spalding County Jail, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
What are you incarcerated for, sir? What are you in jail for?
Change address probation.
Okay. Violation of probation?
Technical violation.
Back in 2017, were you incarcerated with the defendant, Franklin Gephardt?
Yes, sir.
You see him here in court today?
Yes, sir.
Can you describe what he's wearing?
Black suit, black shirt, sitting at the end of the table.
Let the record reflect he's identified the defendant. Did you and Frankie become friends while you were incarcerated?
Yeah, we was in housing unit 1. Both of us were like the Dom Marley.
You're going to have to sit up and speak clearly into the microphone.
We was like the Dom Marleys in the same cell, housing unit 1. We passed the food out and clean up.
So y'all were the orderlies for the dorm, the housing unit?
Right.
And what were some of y'all's duties?
To pass out the trays and clean up.
Okay. Did y'all become friends?
Yeah.
Okay. Did y'all ever play cards together?
We didn't play cards, but we talked.
Okay. Did Frankie ever talk to you about a murder that took place in 1983?
It was like it came on TV, on the news, but they was opening it back up. And me and him was in his room, and they said, Frank, you on TV. And we went out there, but it went off. So I said, well, it'll be back on. And when he came back, we went out inside the table. Sorry about that, my cousin. I mean, nothing against him, nothing like that. When he came back home, we sat down. He was sitting there, but then they went out to his house. And they took some stuff out there. They got 60-something out of the house. He said they won't get no DNA off of none of them. He said I used to burn trash in the well and throw it in there.
He threw what in the well?
He threw a knife in the well.
Okay. So, just to make sure I'm clear, there was a news story on the TV while y'all were in the jail cell together.
Right.
Okay. And it showed agents, GBI agents, searching the residence or the property of Mr. Gephardt?
Right.
Okay. And what did Mr. Gephardt say again?
Well, they had squad me. He said they were looking for DNA. He said they won't get no DNA off now one of them now. He said I used to burn trash in the well. Throw the knife in it. At the time, I think supposed to build a little barn on top of the well. They didn't know it. They took the door off the shed and everything. But the well was up under the shed.
You have any problems with Mr. Gephardt? You mad at him for any reason?
No. God got to take care of it.
Mr. Reed, have I promised you or my office promised you anything to get you to come here and testify today?
Okay, I'm sorry. Frankie Gephardt must be a very, very stupid man. Here he is. He's gotten away potentially with murder for decades, and he's in jail on some other whatever the offense was, and he decides just to tell this cellmate that, oh yeah, they're not going to get my DNA because I threw the murder weapon in a well.
I agree with you, Rachel. This is what I think the cross-examination is going to go.
This sounds crazy.
It really does sound crazy. Here's someone, number one is a part of the prosecution's case is that he's a racist, yet he confides in an African-American person about killing an African-American person. So number one is I think that makes this witness shady. And number two is when the prosecutor at the end says, and maybe this is just my defense orientation and then my defense GNA is, we haven't promised you anything, and he says no, I don't believe a jury believes that, because I don't believe that a person comes forward in these people's situation as being incarcerated and are not looking for a favor.
They all are looking for a favor to try to minimize their sentences, do whatever they can to get out of there. But that aside, so he gave prosecutors some information, and that was the fact that Gephardt admitted to throwing the alleged murder weapon in a well. So, of course, what are prosecutors and what are investigators going to do? They're going to dig up the well and see what they find. So this is a lead up to the break, because when we get back, we'll take you to what they found inside that well. You're definitely going to want to stick around for that. Stay with us here on Law and Crime. Welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Trial Network. We're going to continue to follow that case that we've been reviewing here on the Law and Crime Network against Frankie Gephardt. That's the 1983 cold case murder, a racially motivated attack that went unsolved against a black man. The motivation that he was dancing with a white woman. Before the break, I told you I would tell you what investigators found in Frankie Gephardt's well in the well. Well, according to prosecutors, they found a wooden handle from a knife, 2 separate blades. You see a link to a heavy chain there, pants. They found size 10 shoes, and this is a shed too on the property. Timothy Coggins was a size 10, and they also found a white undershirt there. Coggins was found with only pants and underwear when he was discovered. So this was all found in the well, and you'll remember that we heard testimony from before the break of the jailhouse snitch who said that Frankie Gephardt admitted to him throwing that knife in the well. So prosecutors, investigators were able to recover a lot of stuff that they are trying to link to this murder. So we covered a lot of the prosecution's case. Let's now listen to the defense's closing arguments. Take a listen.
A 6th grade education for which they said they did not doubt. And I think by you all listening to it, you understand that that's exactly what education level that he was at. But they went and investigated it, and they found that Terry Reed wasn't present. So you just showed that one of your jailhouse witnesses is a liar, who will tell a lie. Because you know you can verify that kind of stuff. Because everything's recorded and videoed in that jail, and if it had happened, you could find a recording, an audio or video of what happened, and try to corroborate it or not. But you didn't hear anything about that. Said that Terry Reed said that Frankie Gephardt told him that the victim's penis was cut off, put in the mouth. Again, it's not true. So either Mr. Reed is lying or Mr. Gephardt doesn't know what happened. And if he don't know what happened, it was because he wasn't there. Because people are making up stories. Ladies and gentlemen, that didn't happen. But that's what Mr. Reed is saying that happened. He told me that. Oh, yeah, he told me what they did. So it's not true. It's not true. It's a reasonable doubt because it's not true.
All right there, you are hearing the defense's closings. I think that this attorney did a little bit more of an effective job than the other co-attorney that did the openings. Wouldn't you agree, Mike? Yeah,
it was funny as he was speaking. I was thinking in my mind the difference in just his pace and his tone, and it seemed more of a passion in defense of his client. And I think he did a very good job. I mean, you work with what you have, and he made a distinction about admitting to a crime and telling the story about a crime. And I thought that was a very strong point for the defense, and I think that'll carry well for him.
But at the same time, he kept saying all these people are making up stories. And yes, it seems probable that one person could make up a story, but what are the chances that so many of these witnesses would make up a story implicating Frankie Gephardt in this crime?
Well, in some instances, I think it's more likely, especially when you have cold cases, because the storytelling just keeps creating. It's like a game of telephone. If people start, you keep repeating the same story, people believe it to be true. And once they believe it to be true, it spreads. And that's actually how myth, folklore, things of that nature start. That's what I would be hammering in, is the lapse of time between the actual incident and being here at trial, and how people could come together and corroborate and make sure they fact check and get their deals, especially with cooperating witnesses.
All right, let's go to Judgment Day. Let's take a listen to the verdict in this case.
In the Superior Court of Spalding County, State of Georgia versus William Franklin Gephardt, defendant, criminal action number 18R105A. Having considered whether the state has proven each element of the following offenses, we, the jury, unanimously find as follows. Count 1, malice murder, guilty. Count 2, felony murder, guilty. Count 3, aggravated battery, guilty. Count 4, aggravated assault, guilty. Count 5, concealing the death of another, guilty. Signed this 26th day of June 2018, signed by their foreperson. Do y'all wish to look at the verdict form?
Okay, there were some people that were actually relatively surprised by this guilty verdict because, again, we have 7 witnesses testifying. 6 of them were in jail. So you really have, were incarcerated at the time. So you really don't have the strongest credibility when it comes to the witnesses. Like I've said over and over again, you don't have physical evidence. You do have what was recovered in the well, which was the knife handle, and, you know, that white shirt that was believed to be worn by Timothy Coggins, but you don't have that direct evidence. Were you surprised by the verdict here?
Well, you know, circumstantial evidence, I think, is very strong, and I think it's sometimes a lot stronger than direct evidence. One of the things that I thought was the biggest hurdle for the defense was the fact that they did have a witness who, regardless of his credibility, said that certain items could be found in the well. Mm-hmm. And if there was no gap or any other independent evidence of that, that's really strong evidence. And if I was the prosecutor, that's what my
the fact that they were found in the well. The witness says they were in the well, that Gephardt told him in jail they were in the well. That in itself wouldn't be that incriminating. But the fact that investigators went to the well and dug up what Gephardt said was there is pretty good evidence that this crime happened.
Especially if there was no lack of anybody else who had that knowledge. So I think that was really what sunk it down the well.
If they hadn't had, and we're reviewing the pictures of what they found in the well, at least some of it, and you see the chain there, because it's alleged that Timothy Coggins was dragged with that chain, his body. And that is actually a picture of the well. The well is in the shed there. But you believe if that evidence didn't exist, if it was just based on the anecdotal stories of the witnesses who said Gephardt killed this guy, that we wouldn't have seen a conviction?
I don't know. The one thing that troubled me that I didn't think was emphasized enough, putting on my prosecutor's hat, was the fact that one of the motives for this murder was the fact that he was messing with, allegedly, his old lady. And they never really played out the part that his genitalia was mutilated,
yes,
which I thought was very, very corroborative of the motive and the intent. And
especially if it had to do with this white woman in the club.
Correct.
In fact, when I watched this first trial, I did not really key in on the genital mutilation until I was reviewing my notes just today and listened to some of the testimony. I agree. I think that the prosecutor should have keyed in more on that. Regardless, they got a conviction here, but certainly might have helped.
Yeah, and you always got to worry because, you know, there's always appeals. And, you know, the more evidence that the appellate division sees, the more likely there are to overturn a conviction on some sort of technicality.
All right, Mike Koribanics, thanks so much. You're going to stick around for a few more minutes. We're going to go to a quick break, but when we come back, we have a huge, huge week ahead of us on Monday. We're going to give you a review of all of the cases we're covering. There's some big ones, including the case against Kevin Spacey, so stay with us here on Law and Crime. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Trial Network. I'm your host. I've been for the last 2 hours, Rachel Stockman, and I just want to tell you we have a huge week ahead of us, and for the last several weeks, we've actually been preparing here at Law and Crime to bring you these trials. And the first big case that's scheduled to begin on Monday is the McStay family murders. That's the case against Charles Merritt. He is facing murder charges. There is his mugshot. He's charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder in connection with the killing of that family. They disappeared back in 2010. For a while, police believed that they had fled to Mexico for whatever reason. But on November 11th, 2013, a motorcyclist discovered the bodies of the family in 2 shallow graves on the outskirts of the Mojave Desert. The police conducted a 3-day, 30-hour investigation of the crime scene, and the bodies were then later identified through DNA. It's so hard to see those 2 young kids also that were victims to all of this. 1 year after the discovery of the bodies, Charles Merritt was arrested and charged with murder in connection to killing this family. Charles Merritt was apparently a business partner of some sort of Joseph McStay, one of the victims in this. It's been a case that's really fascinated the nation. It's been in the works for years and years, and now it looks like we're finally going to see this come to fruition. Opening statements expected to happen 12 o'clock East Coast time and 9 a.m. In California. We're not clear at this point if we're going to be able to live stream them. Believe it or not, the judge has not made a decision about this, but has said that they'll make a decision on the day that the trial begins. Either way, we have a crew that's going to be there, and we'll be reporting the details of what happens in that case. As I mentioned, a lot going on. Another big case that we're following out of Michigan. This is the Kalamazoo mass shooting involving a Uber driver that shot 8 people while on his Uber route. 2 survived. He's facing murder charges. And we actually put together a piece previewing what to expect in that trial. Take a listen.
A former Michigan Uber driver could get life in prison for a 2016 shooting rampage that left 6 people dead. Prosecutors say Jason Dalton killed 6 and critically injured 2, including a teenage girl. The frenzy began while Dalton was transporting a passenger from Kalamazoo College. Dalton claimed he began seeing strange symbols on his phone, and a sensation came over his body. He began driving erratically through the streets, frightening the rider, who was eventually able to escape. Dalton told police he drove back to his home and began preparing his weapons. He said he drove to an apartment complex intending to pick up a rider. Instead, he found 25-year-old Tiana Carruthers. Dalton shot her multiple times. Tiana managed to survive. Dalton continued, reportedly fatally gunning down 53-year-old Richard Smith and his son, 17-year-old Tyler Smith, at a car dealership around 10 p.m. The final shooting occurred less than 20 minutes later, when Dalton allegedly shot 4 women and a young girl in a Cracker Barrel parking lot. Sisters-in-law Mary Lou and Mary Jo Nye, Dorothy Brown, and Barbara Hawthorne were among the dead. Barbara's family friend, a 14-year-old, sustained a gunshot wound to the skull, but managed to survive. In interviews with police, Dalton said it was like it wasn't even himself. He further explained to a psychiatrist, "It almost seemed like my phone could control me," despite reportedly having no history of psychiatric delusions. In spite of his claims, he was found competent to stand trial in April 2016. An appeals court threw out the confession Dalton made to police, citing Miranda violations. Dalton pleaded not guilty to the charges. His defense attorney has expressed intent to use an insanity defense. Dalton faces 6 counts of murder, 8 weapons charges, and 2 counts of assault with intent to murder. For the Law and Crime Network, I'm Aaron Keller.
And those opening statements in that Michigan case are expected to begin on Tuesday. We'll bring you that case live here on Law and Crime. Very interesting, Mike Koribanics, who's been with me this afternoon. You heard that the Uber driver, Jason Dalton, admitted to a lot of what happened, talking about what incentivized him to do it. But that much of the confession was thrown out, by, all of it, I should say, by an appellate court that ruled that his Miranda rights were violated because about 40 times during the course of this interview, he told police officers that he wanted to remain silent, and they continued to press him. The prosecutor, in order to defend this, tried to cite some kind of public safety exemption to this. It obviously didn't fly with the appellate court, but that's a pretty egregious violation of his constitutional rights.
That's really it is. It's inexcusable. For law enforcement to be trained and not to understand one of the most basic rights of the Constitution, your right to remain silent in the Fifth Amendment, and to pressure and violate. And, you know, the exception, sometimes the prosecutors really are not there to win the motions. They should have just accepted the ruling to teach other police and law enforcement. This is not what you do. And the safety exception was stretching it. The safety exception really only applies to if they don't have the gun or they don't have the defendant or he's on the phone or something like that where you need to save somebody else. I think it was a very
You think the fact that the prosecutor even, the state even tried to resurrect this interview, they should have just said, listen, we fully realize this guy's rights were violated. We have enough other evidence. We're not even going to fight to try to admit this interview into evidence. And the truth about the interview, too, is we heard some of it from Aaron Keller's piece there, is that I don't even know if it really helps the prosecution, because he's trying to claim an insanity defense.
Well, that's another reason why. I mean, this all may come out in the proper forum if they're claiming an insanity defense, because clearly if you claim that, the state has an opportunity to then do their own review to see, in fact, whether or not he's insane or competent to stand trial. So I think this has just been a big blunder.
Yeah, it certainly is. But the question is there enough evidence then, with the confession aside, because that's been thrown out, to convict him? And you do also have a surviving witness as well who's expected to testify. So that's going to be pretty damning testimony.
And you also have a cell phone. I mean, cell phones now just give you a whole history of the day's events.
Exactly. All right. Really quickly, another big case that we're covering. Like I said, we have a lot going on here on the Law and Crime Network. Is the Kevin Spacey case. That's happening in Nantucket. He's expected in court at 11 o'clock. And this is just, we're playing this video. I'm sorry, it's even creeping me out to look at. He posted this video to Twitter the day that these felony charges for alleged sexual assault were announced. He was in the character of Frank Underwood from House of Cards, basically, and you've probably heard it, denying the charges. Really quickly, Mike, was that a good move, if you were his defense attorney, to post that video?
If I was his defense attorney after that video, I don't know if I'd be his defense attorney today.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, he must have run it by someone. I'm sure they were yelling and screaming not to do this. I know he claims he was Frank Underwood's persona at the time, but it's, such bad PR. Could it be admitted as evidence during the trial, potentially?
They're going to walk a tightrope with this, because some things that don't seem admissible today become admissible later on as the trial develops and it organically grows and has some context and perspective to it. That's troublesome.
Yeah, and listen, it's not a good look at all for someone that's facing these very, very serious charges. As I said, we're going to be covering this trial, this case. We're expected a hearing on Monday. Aaron Keller on the Daily Debrief is going to have much more on the Kevin Spacey case, so stay around for that. Thanks so much for joining us here on Law and Crime. Have a nice evening. It was a pleasure being on, and now you're